The following is a discussion between Sam Harris and Swami Sarvapriyananda, two individuals who I respect massively. So I've probably listened to both these guys independently for countless hours. I've really enjoyed their perspectives on things. And this discussion is going to be a really cool way for me basically to go through my opinion, at least from a Sikh perspective, as to the content of what they're saying. What they're going to be covering is Buddhism and in comparison to Advaita Vedanta. So Sam Harris here is actually an atheist, and he was one of the four horsemen that they used to call him back in the day, alongside Richard Dawkins and Christopher Hitchens and another individual, I can't remember, Daniel Dennett. So these guys were basically publishing books on atheism at the same time. And they're very prominent voices in the atheist sort of side of the argument as well. They're less so prominent now, I guess, and Sam Harris in particular sort of like become less popular due to, I guess, his stances politically, which I don't really agree with either, but I still really value his perspective on spiritual topics and particularly his arguments regarding free will and determinism as well. I don't agree with him on his stance on morality. I mean, I might be wrong on this. It's been a bit rusty on some of his views, but from what I remember, he's a moral objectivist, whereas I think the sort of like moral subjectivist position makes more sense. And we'll probably go into this in another video at some point. There's an excellent discussion between Alex O'Connor and Sam Harris. Alex O'Connor is a motivist, but again, I might react to that one, so let me know if you want me to go through that one as well, which I think is a really excellent discussion too. But outside of this, Sam Harris is also a neuroscientist, and he's quite a well-respected philosopher in his own regards. So he's going to be taking a kind of Buddhist position, because what's interesting about Sam Harris is that although he's an atheist, is more of a heavy critic of the Abrahamic traditions in particular. One of the initial reasons he became popular in the first place, like all those years ago, was because he was a heavy critic of Islam. And there's still a lot of those clips and debates and stuff, which are available on YouTube, are very worth going through, because a lot of those arguments still stand up today. He's very, very articulate speaker, very well spoken, very thoughtful as well. But when it comes to Eastern traditions, he's also quite well versed in them too. So he spent quite a lot of time studying from the Advaita Vedanta and particularly the Buddhist schools of thought as well. So he's going to be coming at this conversation from a Buddhist angle and representing that side of the debate, I guess. Swami Sarvapriyananda, on the other hand, is a monk from the Advaita Vedanta school. He's also studied Buddhism extensively, which they'll go through in this discussion they're having as well. Swami Sarvapriyananda, I remember he's really good at trying to understand the non-dual aspects of things. There's great meditations he do as well regarding like subject and object and this sort of stuff. I used to watch him a lot back when I was at sixth form as well. Now, obviously, the Advaita Vedanta school, they're heavy on the non-dualism stuff and sort of like rationalizing your approach to get there. And whilst we as Sikhs are also non-dualist in a sense, or at least I am, how I understand Sikhi, what I think Sikhi's central claim is, I think there's lots of overlap here, lots of things we can learn. And especially when we're comparing it and contrasting it against Buddhism. And we'll go into this again as the discussion unfolds. But just to preface this, I might not play the entire discussion. I might just, when I'm editing this, I might just clip out to the interesting parts, because it's a very long discussion and not all of it's that relevant, I guess. So what I'll do is I'll link the full discussion in this description below, and I'll highly recommend you guys to go and watch the discussion in full if I don't show it here. I probably won't be able to get the time to go for all of it in one sitting, at least. There's also no video from the original source. It's literally a podcast discussion, so there's nothing to watch, really. And even this video as well, we'll publish it as a video, but it's going to be one of those ones where you more want to listen to. I might throw a couple of things up on the screen, which I'll communicate if I'm doing that. But I'll try and also make this available on our Substack, which you can listen to as well. So just skip the first little introduction bit where it's giving Swamiji's background, which I think is important, but I just want to skip it for now. I just want to get really into the meat of this and really react to that kind of it from a Sikh perspective.
Yeah, well, it's my approach to this topic has been somewhat idiosyncratic, just based on my experience studying in various traditions and spending time on retreat and integrating what has always seemed to me to be the highest wisdom of the Indian and Buddhist traditions in ways that the purists in those traditions would, I think, generally want to resist integration. I think if you talk to most Buddhists, even most Buddhists who are teaching their version of a non-dual approach to practice, and here I think you find it mostly in the Tibetan tradition among Dzogchen teachers and Mahamudra teachers, although there are certainly non-dual approaches to Zen as well. Or if you talk to exponents of Advaita, I mean, correct me if this has not been your experience, but certainly on the Buddhist side, I would say that very few Buddhists will want to say, well, yes, they're teaching precisely the same thing. And
Yeah, I just want to pause it here really quickly because I think it's quite an important sort of like observation, I guess, to make is that once you establish a kind of school of thought and a sort of like methodology to even realize the same thing, because my intuition's been the same as well. I mean, obviously, correct me if I'm wrong, and many of you guys will have more knowledge than me on a lot of this. But my intuition as well is a lot of the time, a lot of these traditions and schools of thought are pretty much talking about this exact same thing. And they seem to have the exact same goal as well, right? The end goal, at least. It's just a matter of difference in methodology and how to get there. And for some reason, this just might be a natural human thing to do, but you want to kind of form your own unique identity by doing this. And as a part of forming your own unique identity, it requires distinction, right? So you're going to want to push away from others who even seem doing very similar thing to you in order to maintain your own autonomy and independence and your own unique identity as a tradition, as a school of thought, etc. You'll over exaggerate some of the differences in methodology, at least. And we Sikhs are no different. You'll see many Sikhs doing the same thing. Many Sikhs seem to get a bit insecure about a lot of this, right? The fact that you even mention Hindu stuff, they seem to get quite insecure, and there's no reason to. I mean, the Gurus themselves were happily engaging in these sorts of discussions and topic areas. They made many references in Gurbani on these sort of things, right? There's no issue in playing with these concepts and exploring these different schools of thought. But there is a place for unique identity as well. But I believe the importance in having a unique identity relates to more political objectives than spiritual objectives. Because if you want to become more spiritual, let's say, then it's about letting go of identity and distinctions and realizing the underlying oneness of it all. But when it comes to political objectives, then having things like, oh, that's an enemy, that's an ally, that's a threat, that's an opportunity, this becomes quite useful, right? You can only engage politically if you have a very sound system of identification, self-identity, objective setting, goal orientation, all this sort of stuff. So it makes complete sense doing it there. And that's what I suspect is going on even amongst these schools of thoughts, the Buddhists and the Advaita Vedanta guys, sort of trying to politically outdo each other. Because you remember, I mean, and they'll mention this in the podcast, I believe, they'll touch upon it. The India was a Buddhist country at some point, right? It was previously this kind of Vedic society or Hindu society, whatever. And the Buddhists sort of took over, became very prominent. And then you had this got 1,000-year debate, and sort of like that's kind of the forge in which Advaita Vedanta as a school of thought kind of emerged out of to kind of wrestle back the consciousness of the kind of like Hindu population. So there's definitely a political element to this, and I guess even today's distinctions and sort of competition between these schools of thoughts is probably a legacy of that.
And there's something confusing about the Indian Advaitic emphasis on retention of the word self, capital S, to name the underlying reality. Whereas in Buddhism, there's an emphasis on no self, or the illusoriness of the self, or the underlying reality being emptiness. And so there's a negation in Buddhism and a positive affirmation or seeming affirmation of a reality on the nominally Hindu side of the Indian tradition. And most people in each of those traditions seem to still assert some kind of sectarian difference, but I've never felt that difference could, in the end, be true. It just seems to me that you take someone like Ramana Maharshi and someone like, to pick a Tibetan at random, Longchenpa, though they're using slightly different framings to describe this ultimate experience, it just seems to me that they must be talking about the same experience. And I certainly have been led to my own experience of these things by both ways of describing the nature of mind, and have found them both useful. Although I tend to emphasize the Buddhist negation more than anything else. So
I think that's really important there, the word you use there, useful. At the end of the day, these schools of thoughts and methodologies, they are just tools to be used. So especially for like a Sikh, we shouldn't have any like sort of like concern about using different tools to understand the one in maybe different ways. I mean, there's lots of different Sikhs. The gurus themselves would use many, many different strategies to appeal to many, many different types of people from many different backgrounds. And I'll probably show you an example of this later as well. But Gurbani is designed consciously in a way in which to attract and very get on this level of both the simplest person in society and maybe the deepest philosopher in society. Sikhi works with both these people because the access points are many, but it's still the same truth you converge unto, just about different ways to get there. So when he uses the word useful, I think that's really critical to understand that a lot of this comes down to utility. These are tools to be used in order to help aid your understanding. What tends to happen a lot, though, is people get attached too much to the tools and they build a pride in the tool that they use. And they sort of get so obsessed with the tool, they sort of forget what to use a tool for. It's like basically two builders arguing over whether to use a drill or a screwdriver. But they get so focused and preoccupied by this argument, they forget actually to screw the screw, right? So that tends to happen a lot. And what we call this process is dogma. And this sort of like openness to many different tools is kind of like key to the Sikh approach. Both spiritually, where the Guru gathers philosophers and argues from many different traditions, and again converges them into one Granth, into the Guru Granth Sahib. So there's many perspectives. But also politically, so when Guru Gobind Singh is inviting philosophers and political science type people from all over the Indo-Persian sphere into the Anandpur Darbar to study and relay political science to Sikhs. So this kind of openness, this secular kind of approach is very at the core of what Sikhi is. So even now, I like the way they're framing the discussion regarding, oh, the Buddhists have like sort of like formalized one way. The Vedanta guys have done it another sort of way. But can we sort of like see the value from either way? Maybe there's other ways too, but it's still the sort of like converging into the same sort of like root understanding. Or are they? I mean, like maybe it's different. I mean, these guys, I guess, will go into it a little bit, but I'm interested to hear your thoughts on this as well.
Anyway, I know you've gone over the same ground in your own contemplation of these things. So I'm wondering if you see the matter differently in any way, or if you've unified both ways of talking in your thinking about these things.
Yeah, to begin with, I think we agree substantially on this point about the purists on both sides. You're absolutely right. I can speak from the Advaita side. From the Advaita side or from the Vedantic side. In fact, there are multiple schools of Vedanta, but we are here primarily concerned with the Advaita Vedanta or the non-dual Vedanta.
Yeah, I know I keep pausing it quite quickly, but I think this is a very good point to touch on too as well. Like, not all of Vedanta is Advaita Vedanta. So the kind of like three schools, I don't think they mentioned this, hence why I'm just going to say it now, is like the three sort of approaches to Vedanta is there's a non-dual Advaita Vedanta approach, then there's the Dvaita Vedanta approach, the dualistic one, and then there's also Vishist Advaita Vedanta, which is kind of called qualified non-dualism. Now, to my limited understanding of what this Vishist Advaita Vedanta thing is essentially it accepts the claim that everything is ultimately one, like it's all Brahm. But there is a multiplicity to this, that there's a lot of diversity of that. The way it expresses itself is a multitude of ways, right? A large variety, which I don't know, like if the Vedanta, Advaita Vedanta guys simply deny that, because it seems to be true at some level that, yeah, there is a lot of diversity. But that only seems to be true from the like sort of like perspective of a independent reference point. And when you establish an independent reference point like a self, in which to differentiate between different elements of that one, then you are engaging in a bit of duality there. But that might be useful to do, because how do you do, like, for example, bhakti or loving devotion towards something which is your spiritual practice at the end of the day, right, to really realize the ultimate truth. What I think the Advaita Vedanta guys are doing is sort of saying is, even those apparent diversity seems to be and ultimately an illusion. So I don't know if the difference here is really that deep, to be honest. And what I've heard as well is like Sikhi takes, like a lot of people say Sikhi takes more of the Vishist Advaita Vedanta sort of like stance, I guess. I mean, you got some people from that tradition who are one of the authors, or a couple of the authors of the Guru Granth Sahib, so like Bhagat Namdev, a big Bhagat Kabir comes from it as well. And also Bhagat Ramanand as well, which has a few Shabbas in Gurupani. These are from that sort of like Vishist Advaita Vedanta sort of school of thought. And I think it's important to realize what the utility of having a kind of middle ground there is because if you sort of like assume everything's not dual to begin with, then that's very hard to operate like that on a day-to-day sort of existence. And I think what Sikhi is trying to do is acknowledge the ultimate truth of things, but also ground it in your everyday practice. Because I think Sikhi's purpose is a bit unique here, where it's not trying to encourage people to realize oneness and then escape from society, right? Become escapists. It's trying to get them to realize oneness, acknowledge it, but then also remain engaged in society, engaged in duality, in order to achieve particular objectives, in order to fulfill one's dharam, right? So this part of Sikhi, I think, is rather unique, I suppose. It's unique to the Sikh approach, and particularly the approach of engaging politically. So there's obviously the householder's life fine. That's like one very common way as well in like sort of like this Hindu, Buddhist, whatever. But it's particularly the kind of call to become Raja, to become rulers and establish environments in which those pursuing mukti and pursuing these understandings of oneness can do so in peace, free from tyranny, right? Which is literally my working definition for what Khalsa Raj is. Quick advert. If you support our work and want to see more like this, consider subscribing and following us on Instagram. If you'd like to support us financially, then also consider becoming a patron of the Bunga through a paid Substack subscription. Any portion of your dasfand is deeply appreciated, and it goes towards helping us expand operations and putting our theories into practice. Visit bungaazadi.com/support for more information. The link is in the description below.
All of these Vedantic schools are unanimous in general in refuting and rejecting Buddhist schools. And one must remember that the Hindu schools and the Buddhist schools had a long history, really very long, and nearly 1,000 years of debate on these issues. So the Buddhists rejected an immortal soul, a concept of a god, and the Hindus defended an immortal Atman and Ishvara or God. And there were numerous different differences epistemologically and so on. So about 1,000 years of debate, which is all very good. I think, I mean, if you ask who won the debate, it depends on whom you ask. But I think what
the
really
Muslims
won the debate, that's true. You're right.
Yes, it's a solid point he makes, right? Because this is, I guess, the key, the kind of crux of what Guru Gobind Singh's frustration was with the sort of like general Hindu populace of the time, right? There's so many were very much engaged in this pursuit of like deep philosophy, understanding oneness, doing spirituality, whatever, right? Which is great. I mean, you should do that. But the issue with that is that if your sort of like methodology that you're picking, the schools of thought which you, the tools in which you pick up to do realize that, it turns you into escapists and pacifists, then you're going to get steamrolled by people who are more grounded and dualistic. And that is what sort of really happened, right? The Muslims, their philosophy is far more dualistic in comparison. At least most of the time, you'll get exceptions like Sufis or whatever, right? But the types of guys invading, they are dualistic. They have a very like very literal view of a lot of things as well. Like it's okay, there's a heaven, there's a hell, there's a concept of shahidi, of martyrdom. There's a God-given purpose of conquering and imperialism, that sort of stuff, right? Now, if you have a mythology like that, you're going to end up being a bit more successful in imperial pursuits than if you have a philosophy like, oh, it's all one, nothing really matters. What is it? The sufferings are an illusion, pleasure's an illusion, right? Like, yeah, that might be true, but it's like, how does that inform your society and the way it behaves and structures itself? And I think what the Sikhs do, what the Gurus do especially, is they form a synthesis between the kind of Muslim approach to things, but also the deep understanding and the ultimate truths that were present in like the wider Hindu society. So by forming the synthesis, they actually form a great balance between deep spiritual truth and wisdom, but also practical realities of how to defend and creating environments in which those seeking those wisdom, again, can do so in peace, free from tyranny and oppression. So by creating a population that internalizes the kind of yogi kind of mindset, but externalizes a warrior, kingly kind of aesthetic, I think that becomes incredibly important now in order to defend the saints and contest the tyrants. And I think that's the kind of uniqueness that Sikhi provides. It's about building a civilization that can contest tyranny whilst also maintaining and preserving truth and wisdom. I think this might also be a good time in which to relay my idea regarding why I don't think Buddhism is mentioned or given much attention in Sikh sort of theology. So obviously feel free to give me your views on this because I'm really interested to hear what you guys think of my one. I want to hear different perspectives on this, see if I've got it right or there is an actual better answer for this. But essentially, the reason why I think the gurus don't really prioritize or mention Buddhism or Buddhist philosophy all that much is because at this point in history, the Buddhists had already kind of like phased out. The Advaita Vedanta guys kind of won at this point, and they became prevalent, right? So Hinduism, kind of Vedic, like mainstream Hinduism, sort of starts to become prevalent in society once again, and the Buddhists are kind of pushed out. Now, so there's one reason in terms of like there's probably just not that much proliferation of this, so there wasn't much of a need to contest it. And the second kind of element of this is that I don't think Buddhism, or at least a common perception of Buddhism, like actual Buddhism might be different, but the kind of appeal to nihilism, emptiness, negation of reality, a lot of this is quite, it can be quite a pessimistic type ideology, and I don't think that's conducive towards civilization building. And fundamentally, what I think is Sikhi is trying to do is creating civilization and civilization builders. You can't really divorce the political science aspect from Sikhi. Otherwise, there's no point of having a Sikhi in the first place if it's just here to tell you more spiritual wisdom stuff. Again, these guys have already been doing this, literally off the back of 1,000 years debate. The concept of non-duality, of oneness, these are firmly established in the schools of thought already at the time. The only issue that a lot of these guys had was that they kind of dressed it up with dogmatism and gatekeeping of spirituality, a lot of aggressive attitudes, a lot of BS, a lot of blind ritualisms. So a lot of Sikhis' spiritual approach is about cutting through the BS and then opening up the gates to allow more of the common society to access deep spiritual wisdom, right? And the method they particularly choose is through loving devotion, through Kirtan and Simran, and community and seva. So these are great aspects, but a lot of this is also quite political because these are actions that you conduct within duality. So when Sikhs are crafting Sikhi, and then you have Guru Har Gobind Sahib start coming in and really starting to formalize the doctrine of Miri Piri, then that's when you start to realize that this is a development of not just a revival of a non-dual philosophy, but also accounting for pragmatism and remaining within duality, within reality, in order to defend it. It's a bit like, obviously, like you have this analogy of a garden kind of protected by like thorny bushes kind of thing, right? That's kind of what Sikh is trying to be. Now, at least what I understand it, at least, right? Now, the element here, again, regarding the Buddhism stuff, I don't think Buddhists' core philosophy or their trajectory, the way they get to the same understanding, is as conducive towards motivating a society to fight tyranny. If you're kind of coming out from a practice where you're trying heavily to be like, oh, don't associate with suffering too much, don't associate with pleasure too much, right? Then your natural response to tyranny is to basically not to fight back necessarily, but more so to fight against your own reaction to suffering, which is great. I mean, and these are very good things to do. I mean, don't get me wrong, but I don't think it's the same purpose of what Sikhi was trying to do. I think Sikhi was trying to encourage the people to rise up and stand up against tyranny. And that's what the gurus themselves are doing, and that's what they encourage the Sikhs to do as well. So I think that's what's unique about Sikhi. So I don't think the Buddhist core philosophy, this kind of negation of things, was conducive to that as much as maybe the Advaita Vedanta side of things, where it's more affirmation, where you're giving an abundance mindset, but you're not trying to take things away. You're trying to add things in and trying to encompass it all, right? So you're saying there is no self necessarily. You're more saying everything is the self. There is nothing but the self, right? The supreme self, Paramatma. You take all of this, right? So it's about adding abundance mindset, a kingly mindset. That's what I think the Sikhi approach is, trying to maybe integrate and establish more of this way of doing things rather than the Buddhist way of doing things. I think it simply comes down to what's more conducive for civilization building and defending civilization. But again, if you think I'm way off base there and you think there's a bit more of a rational explanation, then please, I'd love to hear it.
In fact, I was just thinking, I once visited Oxford University and they showed me a Balliol College. That was the first college in Oxford University. Actually, it started as a monastery, but it was in the late 13th century. And it just struck me that when the great Nalanda University in North India was being razed by Muslim invaders, Bakhtiyar Khilji and others, exactly around that time. And that's when the first great universities in the West started, actually. Yeah, you're right. So I think one clear winner was philosophy, Indian philosophy, because philosophy really developed because of this long, protracted debate. Epistemology, philosophical language, precision, all of that flowered.
Yeah, and this is such an important point, right? Because this is what frustrates me so heavily about modern day Sikh discourse, is that so many of these sampradayas and people who've like attached themselves and put their babbe on pedestals and stuff, that kind of stuff is just not conducive towards innovation and progress. And as a people, as Sikhs, we're always meant to be innovating. There's a great article by Game Singh called Anti-Tradition. It's about overcoming tradition, and the gurus themselves are doing this, they're overcoming traditions. But we seem to get so fixated on, oh, what did the things of the past used to do? What did the gurus used to do? Let's blindly replicate it. That's just not the approach that I see the gurus were taking themselves, nor encouraging. And as you can see, when it comes to competition, you only get innovation through competition. You don't get innovation when you don't have competition. It's a very core argument of Azadism as well as an economic philosophy. As you read section 3 of the Azadist Manifesto, I go into this in more detail. But the core thing here is, as Swamiji's just mentioned, like they develop languages and ways to precisely talk about these issues, right? And help form systems of thinking. And these form really good ways to access a wider population to spiritual topics. There is a trade-off. Sometimes it can get unnecessarily confusing and convoluted. And as I mentioned earlier, you can fall into dogmas. And you so associate with your independent identities and winning the debate. That's fine, right? You'll get that part as well. But you'll also get all this innovation in terms of how society's general consciousness advances to the next level. Which I think is very, very important to do, because otherwise, when you look at very regressive societies, human liberties and basic rights are just completely ignored, and that becomes hotbeds for tyranny and oppression. And again, as Sikhs, as the Khalsa Panth, our duty, our dharan here, what makes us a unique spiritual and political tradition, is our contest of tyranny. That's what we are, that's who we are. And if you don't want to do that, then become a Buddhist, become an Advaita Vedanta monk, right? If you just want to pursue the kind of like non-dual understanding of things, just go do them. But Sikhi is about creating the Khalsa, and the Khalsa is now the Guru, and the Guru has a duty for Sabratapala and establishing Khalsa Raj. And this is the project, this is the mission. If you don't want to be a part of it, then simply stop playing dress up and go do your bhakti somewhere else. But if you do want to do it, then join us in doing this mission. And obviously, as a Bunga, this is what our whole purpose and motivation is. It doesn't mean you have to pick up like guns and like go on horses or whatever and start stabbing people. That was like the old way of doing things back in the past. Now the battlefield has changed. There's a lot more soft power that's required when creating deep influential change on the planet. And a lot of this can be done legally, ethically, very importantly, and also effectively. And this is the crux of our grand strategy and the various components of it that we push as well.
Now, from the Advaita perspective, they criticize the Buddhists as being nihilists, who do say that nothing exists. And that's not a position that can be taken seriously. They dismiss it. From the Buddhist side, they dismiss the Advaita in common with all the other Hindu schools as defending an eternal separate existence called an Atman. And they show why this is not possible. I remember once I was giving this talk in Delhi University, something in the psychology department, the Advaita view of consciousness. And then there was this Buddhist Lama, a Tibetan Buddhist Lama, who gave the Tibetan Buddhist view of consciousness. Afterwards, in the Q&A session, this lady stood up and asked the Lama and me, that, don't you think both of you were speaking about the same thing? And the Lama sort of hesitated. They're very sweet.
Mhm.
So they disagree with you, but
Yeah.
they'll do so very sweetly. They
Yeah.
said, not quite the same, it's different. And I said, yes, it's like different paths leading up to the same mountaintop. And then the Lama chimed in and said, yes, to the same mountaintop, but then again different after that.
That's very Tibetan. Yeah, that's hilarious.
So this is one thing the Guru Nanak was doing as well, or all the Gurus effectively, when they're trying to form syntheses between these different traditions and sort of say, stop getting so hung up on your sort of like minute differences in basically semantics a lot of the time. You guys are all talking about pretty much the same thing. And if you don't realize this and you get so hung up on your differences, that's how you bridge conflict, right? And this is kind of what they were trying to do. Obviously, the Buddhists and the monks kind of guys, these were working out amongst themselves through this sort of 1,000-year debate. But then the Muslims sort of like doing it with the Indic traditions when they came in, that ended up in a lot of violence. And so I guess the Guru was trying to do another synthesis there. And they weren't alone in this. The general kind of Bhakti and like Sufi traditions of that time were also forming these syntheses. So I think that's what was going on. I mean, you might think, I'm just saying, Sikh is just a mix between Hinduism and Islam. It's a very regressive way of looking at things. I mean, it's a very, I think, modern way to look at it. These distinctions, the reason why we have them is because during the time where a lot of these traditions first came to prominence, they were simply philosophers and philosophies coming up out of general cultures and traditions, right? But when the sort of like world order shifted towards nation states and nationalism, then you also had with it this kind of imposition of a system of representative politics. So it became very important for you to become a very clearly defined, distinct community in order to be politically represented by those in power. Before, no one cared. Like, you had a ruler, he'd rule because he took over your regions, and now you're their subjects. It doesn't matter what you vote and what you think, kind of thing, for the most part. Because if you had an issue, you'd form an army and you fight them and you beat them, right? And again, that's what the Guru sort of did as well. So, but nowadays, like, the way the world works is that if you have an issue, you'd basically convince, you form a political unit, you go campaigning, you go to protest, your vote, whatever, right? And then, so it becomes quite important to have political representation. So as a community, there becomes an incentive to form rigid boundaries where your interests are clearly defined and distinct from other people's interests. And this is where you get a lot of this division and a kind of, that's Islam, that's Sikh, that's Hinduism, where in reality, on the ground level at least, a lot of those distinctions were way more blurry than it kind of actually was. It wouldn't be surprising to see a Sikh who would go to a mandir and a masjid, right? I mean, you still get a lot of this today as well in India, but you'd have this way I define a lot of this is that you have a Sikh population, and what a Sikh is anyone who takes inspiration from the Guru. So if you're a Muslim or a Hindu or even an atheist who's taking inspiration and taking guidance from the Guru to whatever capacity, then effectively you're a Sikh. You are some level of disciple. The same way I kind of a Sikh of these two, right? So like, I'm listening to Sam Harris a lot. I listen to Swami Sarvapriyananda a lot. I'm a Sikh of these people too, right? I learn from them. But the distinction here becomes, who are you a Guru Sikh of, right? So my clearly defined Guru is the 10 human manifestations culminating into the Guru Granth Sahib and also the Guru Khalsa Panth. That is the kind of Guru that I've chosen as my primary source of inspiration and guidance, that everything gets moderated through that lens, that framework. And so by virtue of doing that, I become a Gursikh. And a Gursikh is basically, I use the term synonymously with Gurumukh, one who faces the Guru. It doesn't mean you're shut off from all other influences, because clearly not. But it does mean that there is a hierarchy of influence, that some influences, some frameworks, some tools are more important than others in my mind. And the one I've chosen is, again, Sikhi, right? And there's also this kind of like common saying you might hear is that not all Sikhs are Khalsa, but all Khalsa are Sikhs. But more specifically, all Khalsa are Gursikhs. The culmination of being a Gursikh, if you're a Gursikh, and you take that to its logical conclusion, you'd end up as the Khalsa kind of thing, right? You don't have to become Khalsa. I mean, in my opinion, I think you can get Mukti even without joining the Khalsa. But the Khalsa, when you join it, a particular duty and responsibility and a mission that you have, and that's most of that is political. I don't think any of it is really a spiritual progression. It's a political expression you're doing by joining the Khalsa. But in terms of getting spiritual wisdom in order to attain spiritual realization and liberty, then you can get that from lots of different sources. You can even get it in Islam. You can go through that process and get it as well. And you can get it through Hinduism too. The issue is, how easy is it? Because a lot of these traditions get polluted with dogmatism and frauds and that kind of stuff over time. Not too dissimilar to how we as today, as our Sikh tradition is getting polluted more and more over time, and why it's very important for us to speak up and push back in order to preserve the ease of access to mukti that Sikhi originally provided. Because if we let this fester, it's just going to end up being just another tradition that new people come from and basically form new traditions out of, using Sikhi as an example of, oh, here's just another bunch of dogmatists, right? The same way how Jesus did with the Pharisees, that the Jewish faith at that point was also heavily dogmatic. So then Jesus comes around, and the same way Guru Nanak debunks the Brahmins, Jesus is debunking the Pharisees. The Buddha does the same thing. Buddha does it in his time. He goes around debunking the Pandits and stuff of his time. And time again, these kind of like cycles repeat themselves. So again, bringing it back to this original point regarding, is Sikhi just a mix between Hinduism and Islam? No, especially not today as well, because Islam is a very well-defined Abrahamic tradition. And so is now Hinduism, a kind of mix between a kind of caricature or a kind of summarization of Hindu philosophy more broadly, and embedded with a very heavy sense of Indian nationalism. There's a lot of Stan Puja that goes on now in what classifies as a Hindu. So, and there's another point here as well, is that their primary source of authority for Muslims is the Quran, whereas for the Hindus it would be the Vedas, whereas for Sikhs, we don't really place them as that highly a source of authority at all. We place the Guru as the source of authority. So simply by your kind of primary source of guidance, we are neither Muslims nor are we Hindus. But that's only true for a Gursikh. You can get, in my opinion, Muslim Sikhs and Hindu Sikhs. But you shouldn't get Muslim Gursikhs and Hindu Gursikhs. When you become a Gursikh, you're trying to throw off associations with other schools of thought and stuff, and you're trying to primarily focus on this one. And again, for a very particular purpose. And as I mentioned before, Sikhi provides the miri-piri emphasis, right? The spiritual and temporal emphasis. So that's what Sikhi's unique part is. And even then, just on this point, I know I'm rambling on a bit now, but there's not really that much in common we have with Islamic doctrine, at least if you take it literally, right? We probably have way more in common with, again, like something like Advaita Vedanta, or even just like Hindu, like Bhakti traditions in general. There's way more like overlap there than there is in the Islamic tradition. So especially when Muslims say it, or you're kind of like a mix, it's a good point of contention to then say to them, well, what part of Islam exactly have we taken? I mean, I'm seeing this happen as well, right? There's a reason why I'm saying it, but they would say, oh, the monotheism, you guys believe in one God. We're like, well, yeah, but like, so do a lot of Hindus, right? And our concept of God is far more expansive than your concept. Yours is quite limited, at least mainstream Islam, right? I don't believe in monotheism. I believe in pantheism or panentheism, specifically non-duality. So our concept of God differs pretty drastically, right? And that's a very core point, and everything else is kind of superficial after that. But the bit that makes us distinct from wider Hindu traditions is that we don't place that heavy emphasis on the Vedas. Like, we don't see it as a primary source of authority, as I mentioned. And we're also not like things like pacifist, and we are a warrior kingly tradition that the Hindus largely sort of like fell off with at that point when the Gurus were around. Hence why the Gurus arose as sort of like bulwarks against the Mughal invasion.
But When we look closely at the Advaita Vedanta conclusions, both metaphysical, epistemological, and regarding the ultimate nature of things, and the Dzogchen, the conclusions in Dzogchen, you cannot deny that they are very similar. I remember the first time I heard about Tibetan Buddhism, I was a young novice in our main monastery in India on the bank of the Ganga near Calcutta. And I came across this book in our library by Professor T.R.V. Murthy. The book is The Central Philosophy of Buddhism,
Yeah.
where he talks about Nagarjuna. Yes. And I was fascinated. It's like looking at your face in the mirror. It's not exactly the same, but they're like mirror images. And the closer I looked at it, the more it seemed to me that they are both based on the same central intuition, understanding about our nature, understanding of the nature of consciousness. But they have come at it from different perspectives and they have developed through different growths of philosophical traditions.
Yeah, you get very similar experience like this when you read like the Tao Te Ching about and then compare it to the Sikh concept of Sage, right? A lot of that sort of like flow state stuff. There's a lot of overlap there. And even Stoicism, you'll find a lot of like resonance with a lot of things. Especially today, you find a lot of resonance with Stoicism. And when you read the Upanishads as well, I can't remember which one it is, but there's one that like there's like a katha on Aung. And I encourage every Sikh to read it because I think it's incredibly insightful. And it also mirrors and mimics a lot of like katha you might hear on Ikwangar today by Sikhs and Sikh logics as well. So I mean, again, if you're coming at this and you're very insecure about your Sikhi, then you're gonna get lost, right? Fine, but you gotta remember, like Sikhi is not a very insecure tradition to begin with. The gurus were insecure; they were happily engaging with all sorts of things, right? I don't know why Sikhs today have started to become. Well, I do know why. It's because of what I said earlier. It's a lot of this nationalism stuff that's come in. Which I blame it on, and like so these post-colonial influences in terms of how exactly we review ourselves, and these pressures to be distinct representative units. But I think if you take that aside and you sort of like get out that game a little bit and just simply appreciate truth regardless of source, then no Sikh has really anything to fear from any of these ideologies. What we have is basically more sources of inspiration, more angles to look at the same thing, and more confirmation of like how great the Guru was, because like the Guru had already extensively studied a lot of these things. People seem to forget like the Gurus were heavily involved in speaking with like the scholars and like the yogis and the monks, the stuff of their time. Like they were heavily involved with that. And I don't know why Sikhs are allergic to being involved in that kind of stuff again today. It helps enrich your Sikhi, if anything, right? Like knowing the story of the Ramayan, knowing about Mahabharat, knowing what the Upanishads say. When you read all that, you study it and you expose yourself to thinkers like these, and then you go back to Gurbani, you come back with a much more deeper appreciation of what the Guru is saying and how they're debunking this or how they're contesting that or how they're saying, oh, that's kind of useless or that's very valuable. You appreciate all of this sort of like approach of the Guru even more by exposing yourself to these kind of traditions.
So, yeah, that was my feeling. One of our senior monks writing about this issue, he just says that what the Buddhists call shunyam, the void, we call purnam, the full or the whole or the infinite.
And just a very quick point on this. I mean, there's like undeveloped ideas I have. I'll probably articulate this better another time or maybe another jar of some sort. But at the core of a lot of truths, there seems to be a lot of paradox, and you'll see this all over the place. So, like, having nothing is the same as having everything, for instance, right? And there's also one regarding Azadism itself, right? At the start of the manifesto, I'm heavy on basically debunking the concept of free will, that you don't have one. But then the rest of the manifesto assumes you do have a free will, right? You need to have like justice systems, and this is your action has this consequence and incentives. So it's very paradoxical there. At the core of this, that you have no free will, but you got to act like as if you do, kind of thing, right? There's a lot of this going on. I just thought I'd mention it now, but I'll develop that more, I guess, another time.
And recently, I had time to, had the occasion to study Indo-Tibetan Madhyamaka Buddhism with Professor J. Garfield.
Yeah, I've spoken
You
to him.
interviewed him.
Yeah,
Yes.
he's great.
Right. He was teaching at Harvard University, at Harvard Divinity School. I had heard about him and heard about his works. And so I signed up for that course. And at the end of it, I think I appreciated the differences. I mean, when I entered the class, he clearly told me, Swami, keep your Advaita Vedanta outside the door. And that was wise, because then you can appreciate Madhyamaka Buddhism in its own light, in its own glory. So at the end of that course, I had a better appreciation of the differences between Advaita Vedanta and Madhyamaka Buddhism. But I still can't help but say that I see them as methodological differences, sort of pointing towards the same conclusion and the same realization.
Yeah, exactly. And I've seen this quite often now among Singhs as well, who get a bit weird about comparing Ikwangar type philosophy, our non-duality as Sikhs, to Advaita Vedanta. They're like, oh no, Sikhi Gurmat is different, right? Gurmat is different. But then when you drill into it and into the concept of oneness, when you take the jargon out of it, because a lot of these guys, they like just throw jargon at it. But when you look at it like under the scenes, like, oh, why, what is actually the difference here? It's very similar, like, to the description now Swamiji's giving when he's talking to Buddhists, right? A lot of it is fairly superficial. It's a lot of it's just methodological differences. Even when it comes down to the understanding of God, and what I mean by this is what kind of like pushback I've seen is Singhs will say Advaita Vedanta is saying there is non-duality, right? There's nothing but this kind of like oneness. But what we say is that there is oneness, but there's also the universe kind of thing, right? But God is in the universe. You're just giving extra steps to saying the same sort of thing. There isn't a distinction here at all, and that's what you're trying to realize. But for some reason, some of these things are trying to say there is a distinction. We're kind of like have panentheism, where God is in the universe but also outside of it, right? But this is purely semantic. It comes down to your definition of what pan means, because pan literally means all. So when I say to people that I'm a pantheist more than I say that I'm a panentheist, it's because I'm using the word quite literally for what it means. It's like all is God. So even if there was an outside of the universe, then fine, that's part of pan as well, that's part of all as well, right? I don't really care how you divvy it up. At that level, I don't really care. As long as it exists, it's God, right? And there's no such thing as non-existence. Otherwise, that would be an existence, right? But so there's no non-existence. There's only ever existence. There's only ever God. So when you have something like panentheism, all you're doing there is engaging in a very little bit of duality, where you're starting to the first sort of like cut you make, and you're starting to differentiate, which is fine, I guess, to do, but I don't think it's the ultimate understanding. I think the ultimate understanding is Advaita. But then the kind of like level down is like fascist Advaita, which is what a lot of these things are saying when they push panentheistic views, and we say, no, we're panentheists. But even that is still higher still than a dualistic understanding, where you believe God is separate and like some kind of wizard in a cloud kingdom somewhere doing magic tricks. That is also quite useful for very particular contexts, and there is a hierarchy to this. I believe whilst the Advaita kind of like non-dual kind of understanding is the ultimate understanding, it's not intuitive for most people. Neither is it very useful on your day-to-day existence. Now, the bottom of the sort of like hierarchy, where you have a concept of God being outside of the universe, but as like a kind of separate entity, but not in the universe. That's the lowest understanding, but I can see why that can create incredible value when it comes to, especially with gullible people, and giving them motivation, the willingness to give martyrdom, to expand empire, to convert others. Again, it's what the Muslims are sort of like we're doing, hence why they're so successful in duality. But there's a middle ground, and this is what I think the things are really trying to get at. But from my experience so far, they haven't been able to articulate it as well. But the middle ground is God is outside the universe, inside the universe, and our role is basically to, we're still separate during this point, but we're trying to realize our non-separateness. There's a process there, so there's a appreciation of the non-dual truth, whilst also an engagement in duality. That's the sort of middle ground. But when it comes to what the actual truth is, in my view, I think it is pure non-duality. I don't think there is any distinctions you can make. I think it's all God. I think even the concept of saying this is a universe and that's outside the universe, I think that is also pretty dualistic. I think it's just better just to conceive of it as existence itself. without judgment, without labels, etc.
Sometimes they put it this way, that there is a way of misunderstanding Advaita Vedanta and there's a way of misunderstanding Madhyamaka Buddhism. The way of misunderstanding Advaita Vedanta is to think that Advaita is talking about something, that's something called Atman or Brahman. And the way to misunderstand Madhyamaka Buddhism is that it's talking about nothing. But both of them are actually talking about no thing, no hyphen thing.
Mm-hmm.
The consciousness is not an object among many other objects. Sort of, yeah, that's what I would like to say.
Yeah, well, so I haven't spoken about Madhyamaka much here, and I've tended to not focus on it personally because as a method, it has always seemed somewhat less than helpful from my point of view. I mean, as a philosophical position of really not taking a position, merely not asserting anything and observing the partiality and incompleteness of every other school's assertions. It strikes me as a very well defended view because again, you're really it's quite similar to the Greek tradition of skepticism that started with Pyrrho, but the Madhyamaka is more sophisticated in just how it has worked out. We have more of the literature in the first place, but it's more sophisticated in that it's united with a view of enlightenment that you can't quite find in the same way among the Greeks. But it's a similar position of just bracketing everything with this kind of skepticism that points to the limitations of concepts, right? Whenever you describe something, your mere effort to encapsulate it by concepts is bound to fail if you're talking about ultimate reality. And perhaps we could run through some of what Madhyamaka is as it gets expressed by people like Nagarjuna and Chandrakirti. And there are precursors to it even in the Theravada tradition with the questions of King Milinda. I don't know if you know that text, but it's a very similar analysis of a chariot that shows you that a chariot can't exist without its parts, but chariotness can't exist in its parts. You can imagine a chariot without a door, but you can't imagine a chariot without a door, without wheels, without an axle, you take away all the parts, there's no chariot, but you combine the parts, there's no chariotness in any of the parts. And so it becomes inscrutable what a chariot is. It becomes clear that there's no independent existence that is essentially a chariot. It becomes this mere conceptual designation on on relationships. And so it is with a human being and a self and anything that you might want to concretize as a something. And so, but Madhyamaka as an approach has always seemed to me to be this very, scholarly and, ironically, too conceptual path of analysis of just thinking, of a kind of exhausting thought, about this topic. Whereas there, in my experience, there's a much more direct way to just observe that there is no thing, right? There is no self as you thought there was in the middle of experience. There's just experience. And when experience has no center, it has this inscrutable, unconditioned, undefined, open quality about which very little can be said in the end. And yet it is the condition in which everything you can possibly experience appears. And so Madhyamaka has not been my focus, but I agree that it all sounds right when you begin running through its assertions and non-assertions, but it does stand over and against these other Tibetan traditions like the Dzogchen and Mahamudra, which are more directly non-conceptual and experiential and still have this opposite quality of emphasizing the negative, certainly more than Advaita Vedanta does. But yeah, they get criticized by other Tibetan schools like Madhyamaka for being too assertive of the positive. I mean, they talk about Buddha nature, they talk about the Dharmakaya, they talk about Rigpa, non-dual awareness in ways that seem at moments certainly recklessly assertive of an almost Brahman-like reality that is left when you get rid of all duality. And nobody in that tradition would want to hear me say that, but it's just, at the end of the day, it really begins to seem like we're parsing words once you get to the other side of this primary illusion of subject-object duality.
Yeah, there you go, right? I mean, it's going against the grain of what sort of like the Buddhism's core methodology is about negation, right? So, so, so it's pretty funny actually that there's some hesitancy regarding like giving affirmations to things. So then, oh, you might be like their team, which I guess like is important to some degree. Like if you're going to establish a tradition where, as an independent tradition, and your identity is around your methodology, then yeah, it's quite important to maintain sort of your approach, I guess, as a distinct approach to another approach. Whereas when I look at Sikhiya, I don't really see this kind of insecurity present, especially with how the Gurus approach this topic. Because whilst, yes, we have a far more heavy emphasis on affirmation, I suppose, right? Where it's not about rejecting and denying duality so much. It's more about recognizing it as an illusion, sure, but very much appreciating the presence of God within and as creation, right? And whereas the Buddhists seem to be doing it as, oh, there's the nothingness, right? It's all empty. It's also, I mean, yeah, it's difficult to talk about because they're so similar. It's very subtle, and albeit semantic differences a lot of time. But the point I want to make here in this pause, at least, was the Gurus also play with the negation aspect too. So if you look at Job Sahib, I mean, the whole start of it is just like negation and saying it's not this, not that. It's nitty approach, right? So we've very much covered all of our bases in Sikhi. Well, the Gurus have at least, right? So it's very easy to access Sikhi, right? So a Vedanta monk would appreciate Sikhi just as much as a Buddhist, in theory, should appreciate Sikhi as well. There's something here for everyone. But what we're trying to do is that, okay, fine, you sort of like, we're on the same wavelength. We've established that. But what do we do now once we are on the same wavelength, right? Now, the kind of recommendation or the attitude or the culture that the Vedanta guys had pushed and the Buddhist guys had pushed was monasticism, right? Becoming a monk or renunciate. Whereas what our prescription is that, fine, get the truth, but stay in society. Because if all the monks and all the guys who get spiritual wisdom and stuff escape and hide in the jungles and the caves or whatever, then who's going to be left in society when it's all the bad people, right? So what the Guru is saying is, don't hide. Like if you're fearless, if you transcended fear, transcended hate, etc., right? Then don't have an issue with picking up arms and becoming a larger rulers. Because if anyone's going to rule, it should be you lot, the ones who have spiritual wisdom, who have a deep appreciation of the non-duality, the oneness that permeates every single human being. So that's what the Gurus are crafting: a population of warrior kings with a spiritual foundation.
Well, yes, I, in fact, think exactly the same thing about, say, Dzogchen and Mahamudra. It seems to point to the same intuitive realization of the consciousness nature or the pure being nature of the self.
Hmm.
But what you were saying reminded me of this book. Somebody recommended to me, I found it very useful, Progressive Stages of Meditation on Emptiness by a Lama, where he takes up this concept of the void of emptiness.
Yeah, sorry to interrupt this guy here, but like, I'm not very fond personally of the void interpretation. Like, it's just not. It just doesn't make. It makes sense, right? I understand what they're trying to do and what they're getting at, but it's like, it's not nice. Fundamentally, I mean, it's not all that accessible really either. I mean, like, there's clearly something here. It's more of a debate on what is the true nature of that something. It's not like it doesn't exist. There is some existence here. So kind of like saying void and emptiness, I don't think it really points towards, at least not intuitively points towards what's really going on, as much as a concept of like, no, there's an inherent unity between it all, and there are all these some things, but the distinction between that thing and the other is ultimately illusory. That's an easier sell than saying there is no things, there is void. And I know that might not be exactly what they're saying, but that's the kind of vibe you tend to get from each of these approaches, right? So, and the vibe of it, the kind of like the layman sort of some summary of it is important because that's what most people tend to get. It's not necessarily the deep philosophy of it all, where you're going to become kind of a scholar and you figure out the systems in which to speak about it to a very precise way. It is going to be the more like mutta kind of like general broad stroke, very similar to how I'm describing these things now. Is that's what most people are going to sort of like get from it, and that is also in turn what informs the proclivity of your society. And I think it's quite important then that we have more of an abundance affirmation based society rather than a negation based society, because one's more inherently optimistic and one's more inherently pessimistic. Now, I understand fully that's a generalization, and you'll probably find Buddhists that are far more optimistic than Hindu monks, right, and vice versa, right? So these are very general, but when you're speaking at levels of societies, which Sikhs are, where at the end of the day, we're statecrafters, so we got to think about it from a statesmanship perspective. That's the kind of like way, that's the kind of concerns and stuff I would have as a Sikh, from looking at it from a Sikh perspective, if that makes sense.
And starts with the Theravada interpretation, and then he goes on to the Yogacara interpretation, the subjective idealists, and then he goes on to the two Madhyamaka interpretations, the Swatantrika and then the Prasangika. That's usually where Madhyamaka stops, the Prasangika Madhyamaka, because that's taken as the supreme development of Buddhist thought in Tibetan philosophy. But here, this particular Lama, he goes on to talk about the fifth understanding, the sort of final understanding of emptiness. I think it's the Jonang school or something, which sounds very much like Advaita Vedanta. Like limitless consciousness being the Buddha nature, and that is directly realizable by Dzogchen or Mahamudra inquiry. Somebody told me that something similar like that is there in Chinese Mahayana, but I don't know much about Chinese Mahayana. I'm not much at all, actually. So this is where I find the closeness between Tibetan Buddhism and Advaita Vedanta. Philosophically, the sort of final developments of Prasangika Madhyamaka on the negative side, because they would never ever make a commitment which Advaita freely makes about the ultimate reality being pure being or pure consciousness. But then the Dzogchen, the Mahamudra, developments, they seem to mirror the Advaitic analysis. The chariot example, that's interesting because in fact, my final assignment in Professor Garfield's class was to defend the Advaita position against Madhyamaka, against Chandrakirti, in fact. Chandrakirti takes the chariot example and shows the 7 ways in which there is no chariot, and applies that to the 7 ways in which you cannot find a self. And so I called that paper Chandrakirti's Chariot, and Garfield actually liked it. He said it's a solid defense showing how the Advaita thesis actually escapes the Madhyamaka net. Let me show what I mean by the similarity between the Advaita understanding of the self and the Madhyamaka, or let's say the Madhyamaka and Dzogchen understanding of ultimate reality, or the lack of ultimate reality. In the Taittiriya Upanishad, so Advaita Vedanta is based on the Upanishad, so the root texts. In the Taittiriya Upanishad, in the 2nd chapter, there is an analysis of the self. And it starts off by saying that the self is limitless consciousness existence. In Sanskrit, Satyam Jnanam Anantam Brahma. So Brahman, the word literally means the vast, the limitless. So Brahman is Anantam, limitless.
Does this get abbreviated to Satchidananda?
Ultimately does, existence, consciousness, bliss. Yeah. But this is one of the earliest formulations. So they say that Brahman, or the ultimate reality, or the self, is limitless existence consciousness. The Ananda, the bliss aspect, again comes in another part of the same Upanishad. But in later formulations, the most popular way of describing the Advaitic self is Sat Chit Ananda, existence absolute, bliss, consciousness absolute, and bliss absolute.
And again, just a really quick point on this like Satchidananda thing, right? the Anand bit especially, like, just look at what that does in terms of the values you embed in society, right? The promise you're given. So if you're given a promise of emptiness, void, nothingness, right? Like, look at how that differs from a promise of truth, wisdom, of conscious understanding, of bliss, right? Anand is bliss. So if that's the kind of target you set, then what is that going to say about your society who adopts that kind of view of things versus society who adopts the view of you're basically aiming for nothingness, right? Or a satisfaction with nothingness. There's very different sort of trajectories a society can take. But again, like, ultimately, that these will lead to the exact same experience, I believe, right? Like, of the nothingness and everythingness. It's ultimately the same thing being talked about there. So once you achieve the realization or enlightenment, and then the experience is going to likely be the same. This ego death type thing, where the sense of a separate self is ultimately perceived as illusory, and only a supreme self, or the lack of a self, again the same thing, would persist, right? And that is what we call God, um, or I guess the Buddhists will call it shunya, right? So, but again, the important part is, I guess, from a Sikh perspective, from my Sikh perspective, is which philosophy, which kind of values are better in terms of what outcomes it produces for society and the flourishing society and prosperity in society, and also the limitations of tyranny in society. That's the kind of primary Sikh concern.
So, in that analysis, what they do is they ask you, what do you think you are? Show us what you think you are. And so we start with the most obvious thing which we identify the self with the body. Now you can see very close parallel with the Buddhist idea of the five aggregates, and how the Advaita analysis, the Vedantic analysis, dismisses those five aggregates as, that they are not the self. No combination of the self is the self. So it shows, first of all, why the body cannot be the self. And then the Upanishad says, all right, investigate further, something subtler, something deeper than the body. So it comes to prana, breath, and shows why that cannot be the self. And it's a very logical analysis, what you consider to be the self is lasting, and this is not lasting. That seems to be unchanging. This seems to be changing. This seems to be an object of consciousness, whereas you are conscious, or you are aware of it, and the object and the subject cannot be the same.
Mm.
For multiple reasons, the body is not the self. When you look inwards, the prana, the breath, is not the self. Look further inwards, you find the mind, thoughts, emotions. Again, for this very, very much the same reasons, they cannot be the self. You look further inward, you find the inquiring intellect, the very intelligence which is doing this kind of an analysis. And that too is subject to, change and coming and going. It's an object of awareness, and so on. And it goes on like this. It discovers progressively five subtler and inner levels of what was considered the self, and shows that none of them can be the self.
Yeah, Swami Sarvapriyananda has a really cool meditation, actually, to try and, like, show people this kind of object-subject thing. And we can do it right now, like, well, at least the instructions of it, right? So you pick an object, like, I don't know, this water bottle I've got in front of me, right? Or even you put your thumb out and you look at your thumb, and you say the thumb is the object, and the thing that's looking at it is the subject. So the eyes are the subject. So then if you close your eyes, and you'll see the blankness behind your eyelids, then you make that darkness, that sort of like that picture you see, that's the object. And then you ask, what is the subject perceiving that object? And then you'll think, oh, that's my thoughts, right? My mind is saying these things, right? Oh, it's identifying it as, oh, that's black, that's dark, that's my eyelids. It's having these thoughts, it's labeling it, right? This labeling system. That is now the subject. But then if you go one layer back and you make even the thoughts themselves the object, what is perceiving that? And that's what the sort of like true self is. That's what the source, the consciousness, and that consciousness persists even when your eyes are open. It was always there. That was the kind of thread between the beads, so to speak, right? Now I'll try and link that meditation in the description. I will remind me if I forget, because I might have butchered the explanation of it. Swamiji explains it way better. So remind me, and I'll put it in because I think it's a cool little like meditation. I remember when I went to do a talk on Sikhi at a primary school, and I did it with the children there, and they really liked it. It's a very cool way to like really quickly sort of like help them grasp what the subject area even is, like what this pursuit is. So it's a cool one to do. Very simple little experiment.
And very interestingly, the Upanishad leaves you hanging there. It does not provide an answer with, now we are going to show you the self, in like those Russian nesting dolls.
Mhm.
But it doesn't say so. It just shows you that the final candidate which you put forward for being the self is not the self. And then it keeps quiet. And the student asks, so the self doesn't exist? And the teacher says, if the self didn't exist, you wouldn't exist, but you do exist. So in that case, what are you? I mean, first you exhaust every possible candidate of the self, and then you deny that the self is nothing. So then what is it? And then it leaves you there. And then, of course, it points towards the self being consciousness itself.
Yeah, this is a peak philosophy, right? It's sort of like uh, embed doubts in people and then keep giving them doubts and then sort of leaving doubts as well. You'll be very comfortable in like paradox and doubt if you want to pursue this kind of stuff, because a lot of this stuff has answers that are beyond articulation. Like words fail. And the gurus themselves say this, right? At a certain level, these words fail. It's like chewing steel. And because it's true. I mean, I'm not sure if it was this video or someone said in a comment somewhere, right? But it's like the tool we're using to describe these experiences and these understandings is limited itself, right? To use language is an imperfect mechanism to really convey this understanding. So naturally then there's always going to be this last step of, you just got to do it yourself. You got to do your own nama bias. You got to do the bhakti. You got to do the spiritual meditation. And because at the end of the day, that realization is going to be yours and yours alone. And the irony is that the nature of what you're realizing is that there is not a you in the first place. So it's very cool. It's I like it a lot. I just like the subject area a lot. I like the practice of it. I like everything about this. It's fun, but it's only fun if you're comfortable with doubts and wrestling with your kind of like the fundamentals of your beliefs. But a lot of people in my experience don't like that, right? And they start getting very uncomfortable having like a crisis. So you gotta be careful with it, I guess. But this is why I think Sikhi is good, because it will take you to these kind of areas where there is a complete like pulling out of the rug of like, your existence. But it would then offer you a method in which to maintain structure in your reality, so you can operate within duality effectively, right? So this is why we have a very strong sense of purpose as Sikhs, and particularly the Khalsa, engaging in Dhanam Yudh and establishing Khalsa Raj, because this is the character we're playing in this play. And we're lucky enough to be playing this role. Although ultimately we should realize in meditation experiences like this is that the same one playing the hero is the one also playing the enemy, right? God comes as both Ram and he comes as Ravan. It's just a play. But whilst you're in the play, have fun, sort of thing. Like play your role, play your character, like fulfill your duty, do your dharam. But having moments where you can step back into the ultimate understanding, right, to remember what the truth here is, that's also incredibly important. So don't get too attached and too associated with the self. That pleasure and suffering starts to become so pervasive in your reality that you get stuck in it. And that's what Simran is. It's literally to remember the truth.
So there you see a very similar analysis to the Buddhist 5 aggregates not being the self.
Yeah, so I think there's a distinction we should make between levels of illusion here, because I've often said that to say that the self is an illusion is not the same thing as saying that people are illusions. There's a level at which you take the whole person, you take the body and the mind. We could play the same game of conceptual analysis with it that Nagarjuna or Chandrakirti or earlier still in the Theravada canon, the perhaps apocryphal Saint Nagasena played with a chariot, right? You can say is a person in the hands, in the head, in the feet, in the shoulders, in the cells of the liver. And it would seem that a person doesn't quite exist. There's no essential personness. It's a mere designation upon person parts, right? And this is both true spatially, it's true temporally. When you look at how the material constituents of a person change over time, we're constantly replacing our atoms, moment by moment. So that there's that, and yet, as a matter of convention, people obviously exist, and it's not fundamentally mysterious that I wake up with my memories and not your memories. I mean, it's just this, that we can talk about people without feeling like we're delusional. But the self that most people think they have, the feeling of I, the feeling that there's a me in the middle of experience, the feeling that there's a thinker in addition to the flow of thought, that is an illusion of a different sort, right? That is something that you can find to be absent in a way that you don't quite find people to be absent. Again, you can perceive people from the point of view of non-duality or a type of awareness that emphasizes emptiness, and there's a kind of an inscrutability to what is left, but it's not quite the same thing as looking for the center of experience and recognize, the I in the middle, and recognizing that no such one exists, and then resting as that condition that no longer feels that there's a center.
So yeah, I think this is where I think a lot of the risk around Advaita Vedanta becomes actualized, because what Sam Harris is saying here is, I guess from a Buddhist perspective, the objective here is basically to negate the self, right? There is no self, there is no self, there is no self, right? And what that can do is create a kind of humility, I suppose, but maybe an excessive humility, which is maybe an issue. But the other side of this, the Advaita Vedanta side of this, is basically because they don't negate the self, they're just expanding what constitutes the self. So they're saying the self is more than just this flesh, body, and bones. It's also you, and it's also everything in between. It's that wall, it's that robe, whatever, right? It's everything. So the risk with doing that is, as you're expanding the what constitutes as the self, you can also build or mistakenly expand the ego, right? And this is actually the criticism of Vedanta that Bhai Gurudas ji gives in his Vana as well. So in the introduction to the Azadist Manifesto, I include this passage because I'm talking about very similar topics here, and so I want to include the warning of against Advaita Vedanta as well. So I'll read it out. So it essentially says, after studying or revising the Samveda, Vyas recited the philosophy of Vedanta. In his sermons, he recognized himself as Brahm. No one can see Brahm. In Homme and under illusion, Brahm was forgotten. He placed himself as worthy of worship in the world. He did not recognize the importance of loving devotion. Chanting of the Veds could not obtain peace for him, and he started scorching one and all in the heart of his ego. When Maya and Yamaraja's or Dharmaraja's stick came down on him, he suffered greatly. After getting teachings from Narada, he recited and sang the praise of Bhagavad God's qualities. Without the shade or protection of the Guru, no one can get across the world ocean. And that's from the first Var, Body 11 on Vedanta. So again, the problem here is basically becoming egotistical, saying that, yeah, you're God. But it's a risky understanding, because if you don't also recognize that everything is also God at the same time, there's a risk here where you sort of place yourself above others. It's kind of paradoxical. It's hypocritical to do so, and it's inconsistent with the true philosophy here. But it is a risk that could materialize, and obviously there seems to be a big enough risk that Bhagavad thinks it's worth mentioning here. So this is why I also think where the way that Sikhi and the Gurus kind of promote the non-dual understanding, or at least the primary way in which they do it through Prem Bhakti, is that instead of sort of glorifying the self, they're glorifying you. I say "tu karta, tu hua," right? So it's all this kind of concepts regarding, instead of bigging up, saying the self is everywhere, the self is in everything, right? You're actually saying God is in everything, and it's kind of an encroachment on the self. So by first understanding that everything is God, then the only understanding that's left to do is then realize that, okay, you are also a part of everything. You're not stuck in traffic, you are the traffic, right? So it's all that kind of part, the last kind of introspection, when you turn the third eye inwards, that kind of stuff, right? Then that's when you realize the ultimate understanding, as opposed to doing it the other way around, where you're starting from the start and you're expanding outwards and you're trying to encompass things into you. Because that would risk building homme, whereas the other one is about glorification of the God, which risks dogma, because you get so absorbed in this love, you might not want to do the last sort of step, right? And you might just literally want to just remain in love, which is completely fine, because I think what will happen at that point is, all will happen is you just get a bit of that last wisdom at any point, which is what I think happened to Fagdatanna as well. He had so much devotion for the stone that he thought God was. It was just kind of a little minute bit of wisdom that kind of clicks. And because his heart was pure, it was very open to God. And then so for like someone in a completely brain state, when they're really at the limits of devotion, it's quite easy then to basically do the last tiny step, because you kind of guilt trip it, right? You say, well, if God is everywhere, that's like, you believe God is so powerful, there can't be anything but God. Who the hell are you to be outside of God, right? Like, God can't come into you. Like, what ego do you have? And then out of love, they'll understand that, and they're like, well, yeah, even I am part of that, right? Like, I give myself up to you, God, right? In devotion, in love. And that's when the final understanding is realized, right? And you get to that mukti kind of state. So I think that's a quite important distinction. But again, I don't really see the point of doing the non-self stuff so much. Whereas the Buddhists have done it. So that's why you probably don't see much mention of that kind of approach in Gurubani, where you're trying to just negate everything. Again, we have it. Like the Guru Gobind Singh goes into it, but the primary emphasis, especially of Guru Granth Sahib itself, is worship of God, and realizing God's new non-duality. God's this, right? And then by virtue of that, the logical reduction of it is that it encroaches on the concept of the self, in which you can then remove it. But not as a kind of negation of everything, but as there's just no room for it left, right? That's the best part. That's the ultimate culmination.
I get, feel free to disagree here, but it strikes me that there are two levels of deconstruction that people are in danger of confusing. I mean, we can talk about the emptiness of everything, including, emptiness itself. We can talk about how people and things have no inherent existence, but that's not quite the same thing as the stronger experiential claim that the self, as it's generally felt to exist, doesn't exist.
You're right. In fact, one of the main themes in that course, which I did under Professor Garfield, was the doctrine of the conventional self.
Mm-hmm.
So a lot of the debates in Madhyamaka were about the nature of the conventional self, how this inquiry into what we are. In fact, I don't even like to say who we are, because who seems like a person. It's rather an inquiry into what we are.
Yeah, I like this point, because I mentioned a very similar one in the Azala's manifesto regarding we shouldn't basically call ourselves human beings, we should call ourselves human process. So I'm going to read out that little section from the Azala's manifesto. So, quote, the body is constantly undergoing decay and renewal. Almost every cell is replaced multiple times over the course of a single lifetime. The skeleton renews itself roughly every 10 years, red blood cells every 4 months, and the skin every 2 to 4 weeks. The human being at birth is completely different to the one at death. To even call this a human being is somewhat misleading, as it suggests a static entity. Perhaps a more accurate term is human process. Not even the mind is safe. It changes constantly with shifting ideas and beliefs, as this manifesto seeks to do with you. Memories themselves can be updated, manipulated, distorted, or simply forgotten. So when asking the question, what happens after death, we must first consider, what exactly is it that is dying?
So it shouldn't end up sounding ludicrous, like dismissing our existence altogether. So there is a good deal of Tibetan Madhyamaka dialectics which goes on to develop a robust sense of the conventional self.
Mm-hmm.
And it's interesting to see almost the same thing happening in Advaita. Both of these, on the surface, rival philosophies, and sort of final developments of philosophy in two rival systems, the Hindu systems and the Buddhist systems, and sort of at their acme end up with Madhyamaka and Advaita. And they are so similar. For example, speaking to what you just said about the conventional self, there is the two truths. Both of them make a great deal about there being a conventional truth and an ultimate truth. And I think Nagarjuna got there first. He says that without taking the help of conventional truth, nobody comes to the ultimate truth.
Mm.
In Advaita Vedanta, there is a Vyavaharik or transactional truth, empirical truth, and there is a Paramarthika. There is an absolute truth, which are almost exact words used by Nagarjuna, Chandrakirti, and in Tibetan translation also.
Yeah, and again, something I mentioned in the Azad's Manifesto, that there's these two different perspectives of looking at things, because it's incredibly important that this is done, because mixing perspectives gets messy, and it's why basically the whole reason why I'm going to these topics in the introduction to the Azad's Manifesto is because to engage in statecraft level vichar is a very, like as Swamiji mentioned, is that transactional Vivaharika approach to things. It's not a Paramarthika approach, because otherwise you'll say stuff like, oh, God owns everything, therefore how can you have private property? But then if you have no private property, you can't have grounds in which to claim someone's committing like injustices, because the tyrant and their victim is the same person, right? So there's all that you kind of have to park and put aside in order to engage in duality, as I mentioned, right? Which again, Sikhi does. So this is why even these Advaita Vedanta guys have come up with, and even the Buddhist guys have come up with this distinction, this layering, to try and avoid the risks, even the type of risks that Bhagavad mentioned earlier as well. But I also want to mention, it's very interesting. I think this is really important as well. It's why I included it in the Azad's Manifesto. Is that this layering of things is the Guru themselves do this. So I want to read out is a excerpt from Sheathed by Money Singh's Sikhanda Bhagatamala, which basically reveals the design, the strategy of Gurbani. So what this Granth is basically a series of question and answers Sikhs were having with Guru Arjan Dev during their time. And the whole tome is basically just a bunch of question and answers, right? So what happened was these 4 Sikhs basically went to Guru Arjan Dev and they asked them regarding the question of free will. So they basically highlighted there's some contradictions in Bani, right? So they say to the Guru that on one side you're saying preservation and destruction both are done by the one, there's nothing in the hands of the individual. And then elsewhere in Gurbani you say, as one repeats, so does he sow, the body's a field of actions. The ungrateful persons forget Hari and God oneness and wonder with doubt and reincarnation, right? So both perspectives seem to be given where the free will is sort of maintained and the other one's sort of saying, oh, there is no free will, right? It's all one. So then the Guru basically gives the following answer, and it's pure genius, his answer is, and it's basically going towards this leveling system that these guys are talking about as well. So the Guru says, the sayings within the Guru Granth Ji are all associated with one's particular competency, and the 6 of the Guru represent all levels of competency. One level of competency is related to karma, and to those who are in the competency of karma, for those persons, this saying is appropriate. As one repeats, so does he sow. The body is a field of actions. Those who are at the competency of devotional worship, upasana, for those persons, this saying is appropriate. Prabhu himself is the cause of all causes. But for those who are at the competency of wisdom, of gyan, for those persons, this saying is appropriate. Within each and every heart, you are omnipresent. Hari is the one being merged with all. So there's very important distinction made here, right? But they do it on 3 levels rather than 2. So the difference between the second and the third level, the Upasana and the Gyan level, is the Upasana, you're still maintaining some duality. And this is the whole like Vishist Advaita stuff I was mentioning earlier, where some things say, oh no, I'm a panentheist, is because that kind of understanding is a very upasic kind of devotion understanding. In order to do devotion, you need to have something in which you're devoting to, right? So an I and a you relationship is still maintained, but it's at the point of wisdom, of gyan, where even that relationship breaks down and you recognize it as one, as that one being merged with all, as it's mentioned in this passage, right? So the difference here is basically you're basically taking the last step of realizing non-duality. So then the Guru further goes on to sort of say, and I think this part is important to also include in the passage reading, because it really hammers home the point. So he says, just as in a doctor's office, there are many different diseases present, just as a fever of warmth, cold weather, and cold fever, there are numerous varieties of illnesses. In this manner, a doctor is in looking at the pulse and fluids, prescribes the appropriate medicine for that illness. And through this manner, he alleviates the illness that is suffered by the ill patient. An uneducated doctor will not be able to relieve the illness of the patient. The illness will be of one kind, and he will prescribe an irrelevant medicine. In this manner, the saints and servants of Hari pay attention to the words and actions of the Sikh. In looking at their words, they come to know their inner understanding of their heart. So it's pure genius, because what the Guru is doing is they're not giving one prescription for all people. They realize, and they're creating a movement here that is very secular, as I mentioned before, right? That is trying to bring everyone together and converge on the truth, but also engage in spiritual and political activity. So when the Guru is saying he's basically looking at sects on a case-by-case basis and then giving the correct understanding there, this is how we know the Guru is Jagat Guru, Guru for everyone. This is why I'm saying earlier as well, the Advaita Vedanta guys would appreciate what the Guru is saying, just like the Buddhists would appreciate what the Guru is saying. Even atheists would appreciate it. It's just our limitation today that we don't communicate this sort of like side of Sikhi well enough. But this is what the Guru is doing, right? They're trying to be as openly accessible as possible and get people on the spiritual path. Because as Bhai Gurdashi says in the Avada, if a Sikh takes one step towards the Guru takes 1,000,000 towards them. So let's not create high barriers to entry for people to even take that first step. The easier they can do that, then the faster the Guru can do his job of sort of like resonating with them on their level and guiding them towards the truth. And also then, if they so choose to, guide them towards political activity to create environments in which those seeking to pursue mukti can do so in peace, free from tyranny and oppression. And lastly on this point as well, is probably also worth mentioning is another passage I include in the introduction to the Azalis Manifesto as part of the discussion I'm having here, is from Gobind Gita, so Guru Gobind Singh Ji's version of the Bhagavad Gita. So he says, this method of actions, Garam, is acceptable, that which was instructed by Sri Bhagwan Krishna. By performing good actions, Garam, one's mind becomes pure, then a devotional spirit will reside within one's consciousness. By performing devotional service, love for Hari is realized, love for God is realized. With this love, one recites the virtues and wisdom of God. By having that awareness, that gyan of Hari, one fully understands oneself, which is what you were, that form of Brahm, God existence, from the very beginning. Whoever has the awareness, gyan is stored within their mind, they solely contemplate the non-dual Brahm. They are absorbed in this non-dual. They recognize no other. In this way, one becomes one with Brahm. Whatever you serve, you will become what you place your attention upon. This was sung before by Guru Nanak. From him I received this knowledge which I have presented. And again, that's from Guru Gobind Singh in their Gobind Gita, chapter 2 of it. So again, I'll link this whole passage, this whole introduction to the manifesto, so you can read the full discussion as well. But again, it's very important to see here there's a hierarchy being placed where the first sort of step here is to perform good deeds, right? To basically purify your actions. So becoming ethical, avoiding bad deeds. And through that, you've basically purified your heart. And this creates a good ground, foundation in which to perform devotional worship. Because only with a pure intent and pure heart will you become open and receive the understanding and even be receptive to the understanding of the oneness, of what truly oneness means. So yeah, this is what the Guru is doing. Again, makes it accessible for everybody, and then gives a place for each type of competency. Because ultimately, they're still trying to craft a population of civilization builders and warriors and kings who could contest tyranny. But it's all based on these kind of spiritual foundations. Alternatively, the Advaita Vedanta guys, they're going through it with very one particular way of doing things. The Buddhists are very similar. They're doing very one particular way of doing things. Now, over time, they have their own subsects, so they differ slightly in different things. But the methodology kind of like follows the same sort of way. What Sikhi provides is many paths. They also converge to the same point, as I think you mentioned earlier. You're still getting to that same peak on the mountain. But as Sikhs, as the Guru, because they're so compassionate and they're geniuses, right? Obviously I'm biased, but they actually provide you many start points, and they aid you all along the way, regardless of where you start from. Hence why the Guru is so compassionate.
So yes, nobody's trying to deny, and one should be very clear that there is a person who's doing Madhyamaka or Advaita, the person who's walking around talking and holding a job or running a monastery or whatever. So that person exists at that level. It's all valid. And so the two levels of truth, they come in here. Another startling similarity, when you just mentioned things like emptiness and then emptiness of emptiness. In Advaita Vedanta, there's a whole parallel discussion of mithyatva, which is the falsity, the appearance nature of things. And then there's also mithyatva of mithyatva, the falsity of falsity. You can see sort of a mirror effect here, you know?
Yeah, you might obviously be familiar with some of these concepts as well, because in Gurbani, these things I mentioned too, like shunya concepts like that, mithya, like illusion. You'll see these references throughout, right? So yeah, again, I'm interested to hear what some of you guys think on some of these topics and this discussion we've had so far, especially on trying to debunk what I've said. I've probably made many mistakes because it's a topic that's rusty for me, right? So I'm getting back into it. So hopefully some of these experimental thoughts I've had as well, I'm particularly interested to hear those, like why you think Sikh might not mention Buddhism as much. Like, what do you think of my theory? I'm interested in hearing your theories and your understandings and perspectives on this as well. So I'll probably finish it there today. We're only about half an hour in, and this is like an hour and a half long video. I probably should pick smaller videos to react to. I always pick these long ones, but these ones tend to be the most interesting to me. If you have any other types of clips and stuff you want me to react to or give my perspective on, just feel free to send them or leave them in the comments, and I'll try and get round to them at some point. But again, regardless, I'm looking forward to what some of you guys think on this. And we'll speak again next time. Wadi Khalsa, Wadi Ki Fateh.